Hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of A Peek Behind the Curtain. This one is going to be slightly different in that I'm going to attempt to read a contributory chapter I've written or contributed to from a book that has recently been published called Pandeism, an Anthology of Worlds Unseen, edited by a friend of mine called Knujon Mapson. This is the third and final book of a trilogy of books that Knujon has edited, discussing the intriguing concept known as Pandeism. And put simply, Pandeism is the argument that effectively everything is the emanation of a singular consciousness. We could call it God, we could call it Brahman, we could call it the Or Ein Sof, whatever we want to call it. And it's a concept that has long intrigued me because I believe that you can do the science of this. And indeed, over the years, I think this is what I've been writing about, even though probably for a part of that time I was blissfully unaware of the fact that this is where I was leading to. And in the chapter I've contributed to this particular one, this is exactly what I discuss. And what I'm going to do here is to attempt to read the chapter. Now, what I think is most important, if you don't want to go through all of it but want to get to the really meaty areas, probably around the last 10 or 15 minutes is probably the area that you'll find of most interest. But the previous stuff gives you the background information, which I think will make you understand exactly the power of my arguments and how I pull them together. Well, how I believe I pull my arguments together effectively, and why I genuinely believe that my cheating the ferryman hypothesis really does have power to explain the way we perceive the universe and exactly the point of the universe. It sounds incredibly vain. It's not meant to be. It seems to just make sense to me, and maybe there's a lot of people out there it also makes sense to as well. But let's just see now that the chapter itself, I will edit it as I go through. I might take sections out as I read them, and also I will take the approach of jotting in occasionally and making some comments about my own writings as well, just to make things clearer. So without further ado, let's see how this works. I'm going to be doing this live, as it were. I don't have the ability to edit what I'm reading or saying, so effectively I have to get it right first time. So I apologise to any errors I may make or any pronunciations I may make that are wrong. So here we go. The title of the chapter is called GoDaemonics, a Scientific Model of Pandeism by Anthony Peake. Introduction. There was once a man who said, God must think it's exceedingly odd if he finds that this tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I'm always about in the quad. That's why the tree will continue to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. It was exactly 100 years ago, in 1924, that Ronald Arbuthnot Knox, an English Roman Catholic priest, published this intriguing limerick in an attempt to explain the existence of unobserved phenomenon. In his poem, Knox attempts to explain how unseen objects continue to exist if there is no observer present. He jokingly states that as God is always observing, then all the phenomenal world continues to exist. It was also in 1924 that a French physicist called Prince Louis de Broglie proposed that matter behaved as a wave in exactly the way that light did. This was an astonishing suggestion, one later proved by experimentation. But why is this in any way related to Knox's poem other than they occurred the same year? Well, it does this as it effectively proved that both the previous ideas, which were put forward by a guy called Bishop Berkeley, who was an Anglo-Irish philosopher and cleric, that all we really know that exists in the world is what our senses tell us is out there. And because the senses are actually brain created, therefore we have no way of knowing whether there actually is an out there or not. And this has become known as idealism. But I argue that the concept of pandeism and idealism may have a solid scientific foundation. And in this chapter I will attempt to explain exactly why this may be. The mystery of light. When we use the term light waves all the time. Received wisdom knows that light is made up of waves. After all, Thomas Young proved it in 1800, and school-day experimentations confirm it. As we all know, a wave does not exist in itself. If two people hold a skipping rope between them, they can create a wave along the rope by moving their arms up and down. The wave is not the rope, or vice versa. In the same way, a wave in water consists of water, a sound wave travels in air, and so do light waves. So how do light waves travel in outer space? After all, outer space is a vacuum, so there is no medium by which the light waves can travel. Get ready for a surprise. Scientists have not got a clue what light is for one simple reason. Sometimes it acts as a wave, a disturbance spread over a distance in space, but sometimes it acts like a particle, a point located in one specific place. How can one thing be both? This was discovered by some curious results involving light and an exercise that was known as the twin-slit or two-slit experiment. Imagine dropping a pebble into a pond. The waves form a series of ripples moving out from the point where the pebble entered the water. Now imagine what would happen if a barrier was placed across the pond. As the waves hit the barrier, they bounce back in the direction they came. Now we amend the barrier and we place two holes in the barrier, both much smaller than the wavelength of the ripples. On the other side, when we do this, and we drop the pebble in, on the other side of the barrier, two sets of waves, starting at each hole, spread out as if two new pebbles were dropped in the water at the same place at each hole. As the two new sets of ripples move out, they begin to what is known as interfere with each other, disrupting the flow of the two sets of semicircles. In some places, the two sets of ripples add up to make extra large ripples. In other places, the two sets of ripples cancel out each other, with little or no wave motion in the water. The same exercise can be done with light. Light is shone through a single hole in a barrier. As the light flows out, it encounters a second barrier, this time with two holes, in exactly the same way as my water analogy. The light acts like a wave in that each hole then starts its own wave pattern the other side of the second barrier. So far so good, exactly as you'd observe in normal waves. Immediately the two waves start to interfere with each other. A screen is set up after the second barrier. When the light hits this screen, it shows a pattern of light. When light hits this screen and it goes through, it shows a pattern of light and dark stripes. Again, it's important to clarify here that there is one hole in the second barrier, as we said earlier. These stripes are called interference fringes. They correspond to where the light waves add together, which is called constructive interference, and where the waves cancel each other out, which is called destructive interference. It was in this way that Thomas Young in 1800 proved that light functions as a wave. However, in 1905, Albert Einstein proposed that light was also made up of individual particles. As far as he was concerned, it was the only way that a particular puzzle of early 20th century science could be explained. Well, actually, there's an aside too. The first one was how, as I said earlier, light can travel across the vacuum of space, because all waves need a medium to travel through, like water wave travels through water, and a sound wave travels through air. But effectively, in the vacuum of space, there is no medium that waves. And as we said earlier, you take away the medium, you take away the wave. But in the vacuum of space, there is no medium. So how does light cross the distance between the sun and the earth, or in fact nearby stars? Early 20th century science really had no idea about this, and they came up with a concept they call the luminiferous ether, which was disproved in the 1880s by two guys called Michelson and Morley. I won't go into the details of the experiment, but clearly they showed that there was no luminiferous ether. Luminiferous, by the way, just means light carrying. Okay, that was an aside. Now back to the chapter. When light was shone on a solid object, it seemed to kick out electrons from the surface. Now, just to make a point here, electrons are little solid bits. They are the smallest part of matter. So electrons are physical objects. This phenomenon, known as the photoelectric effect, could not be explained if light was a wave, that is. However, as Einstein said in his 1905 paper, if light is made up of particles, then each particle hits the surface and knocks out the electrons. This supposition was supported by experimentation, and in recognition of this discovery, Einstein was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics. Subsequently, these particles of light were given the name photons, from the Greek word for light, phos. One problem solved, many opened. This dual nature of light, wave and particle, was to cause a radical review of our perception of electromagnetic radiation. That effectively is, light is the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but all electromagnetic waves, from radio waves to gamma rays, are all the same thing, and they are all transferred by photons. If light was also made of discrete packets, how can this be squared with the fact that light is also a wave? In this regard, we need to revisit the Young experiment. We need to understand what would or should happen if photons were sent through the two slits. As an analogy, imagine that the two holes were holes in a barn door, the holes being about 3 times the size of a soccer ball. Now we kick balls against the door. After dozens and dozens of balls, some of them will go through one hole and some of them will go through the other. And after hundreds of balls are kicked through the holes, we stop the exercise. We then look at the other side of the barrier, and we, not surprisingly, will find 2 piles of balls on the other side of the barn door. We would expect to find the pattern, 2 piles of footballs, to be exactly the same if, instead of both holes being open at the same time, each hole was open on its own for half the time, and then the other hole open for the other half. So effectively, just to explain this, you know that you close one hole and you kick half the balls through, then you close that hole and open the other hole and kick the remainder through. So the other side of it, you'll just have 2 piles of footballs, which is exactly the same what you'd get if the 2 holes were open at the same time and you kicked the balls at random. What you would not expect would be a group of balls centered halfway between the 2 holes, right behind the solid door. Footballs, like particles, do not interfere with one another. So that's effectively what you would logically expect to find if particles, little point particles or electrons, were solid. Now let's go back to photons. Now imagine a single photon being fired at the barrier. So this is one at a time. The photon, in order to get to the other side, has to go through one or other of the 2 holes. So remember, there are 2 holes and it must go through one or the other, okay, to get to the other side. That makes logical sense. Recording such a small particle of light needs a super sensitive photographic plate, and this is set up on the other side of the barrier. Each photon, as it arrives, registers on the photographic plate as a single white spot or dot. As millions, then billions, then trillions of photons arrive at the plate, we see a pattern begin to emerge. Common sense would lead you to assume that there would be 2 circles of white light coinciding with the trajectory of each photon through whichever hole it's selected, just like the pile of footballs in our barn door analogy. However, we are dealing with the quantum world where common sense does not exist. In fact, what we do get is the interference pattern again. Now think about this. Each particle goes through one hole on its own. However, something seems to interfere with it as it goes through to form the unexpected interference pattern. This leaves us with one of only 2 options, both of which are peculiar in the extreme. The first option is that the photon starts out as a particle and arrives as a particle, but en route it seems to go through both holes. In doing so, it interferes with itself as it comes through the holes and then works out exactly where to place itself on the photographic plate to ensure that ultimately, and with all its fellow photons, a perfect pattern of light and dark stripes is created. The mystery of this first option is, how does the photon manage to go through both holes at the same time? And having done so, how does it know where to place itself on the photographic plate? This duality of light is a puzzle. But light is strange anyway. It travels at a huge speed, either as a wave or a photon, and seems to be consistent at all times. This speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, is the fastest anything can possibly travel, and it is the only speed that photons can travel. It's the only speed that light can travel, as a wave or as a particle. According to physics, it's impossible to travel any faster. Okay, so what if I'm sitting on a train travelling at 100 miles an hour and I switch on my torch in the direction of travel? Surely those light waves will be travelling at 186,000 miles per second plus an additional 100 miles an hour, which means in effect that they're travelling faster than the speed of light. Because of course I'm sitting on a train, but the train is moving as well, so the train is moving. So relative to the outside world, that light is travelling at faster than the speed of light. But actually, no, it's not. They are still travelling at 186,000 miles per second relative to you on the train, you and the train. However, relative to somebody on the platform of the station that you have just travelled through, the speed of light has been exceeded by 100 miles per hour. However, and this is another curiosity of modern physics, Einstein argued that even relative to the observer on the station, the speed of light is constant. So what is given? Einstein says that time itself slows down or speeds up to accommodate the anomaly. So for you on the train, time was passing more slowly than for those on the platform. At greater speeds, the relative time difference becomes greater until at nearly the speed of light, time almost stops. And indeed, as an addition, at the speed of light, time stops altogether. And as an additional point, which is not in the article, what is even more fascinating is that what takes place is that time and space are the same thing. So effectively what we really mean is that time and space change. Time dilates or space gets narrower. It's called the Lorentz contraction, if anybody's interested. So this is incredibly weird. So what we think is space isn't. It's something completely we do not understand. But so light is weird. But at least atoms, however empty they may be, and to just add here, atoms are 99.9999999999996 empty space. Okay, so just get that figure into your head. That is for a hydrogen atom, by the way, but it shows just how much empty space each atom is. But they are effectively still have bits of physical bits in them, like electrons and also quarks. So atoms are solid, so in the final analysis should not suffer the wave-particle schizophrenia of light. Imagine, however, if it was shown in support of the de Broglie's 1924 theory that electrons and atoms also have wave-like properties, then the same effects will be observed in matter, as in electrons. In 1987, teams from Hitachi Research Laboratories and Gagushin University in Tokyo find that electrons do indeed have the same duality. Problematic, yes, but electrons are still incredibly small, and nobody has ever seen or photographed one. Atoms, now they are different. We can photograph the larger type, so they are solid in a very real sense. However, at the beginning of the 1990s, a team from the University of Konstanz in Germany proved the impossible. Atoms also travel as waves. And arrive as a particle. Your chair is not only made up of vast areas of empty space, But what solidity it has depends upon whether the atoms choose to be solid particles or non-solid waves. So again, to add here, there's no reason as to why your chair and the electrons within your chair and the quarks within your chair couldn't be waves. Rock solid. So the question is, what makes them make this choice? The answer is simple but hair-raising. The factor that pulls the atom from the non-physical wave to a solid point of matter is your mind. The act of observation by a thinking being brings matter into physical existence. Indeed, 2 years after de Broglie made his incredible suggestion in 1926, another physicist, Max Born, suggested that electrons do not actually exist as individual entities, but are merely statistics. By this he meant that a scientist can calculate with great accuracy the behaviour of trillions of electrons, but he has no way of predicting the behaviour of any single electron. We only have a statistical chance of finding an electron in a particular place. And again, in addition here, it's quite important to realise this. We can never know the location or the speed or momentum of an electron. Okay, we cannot know both. We cannot know both. And it's very important to be aware of that. He termed this the probability amplitude. Born then proposed that the wave function of electrons is as a statistical wave, similar to a crime wave. It's a mathematical function. It's not a relationship of something that is really out there. As such, a crime wave itself has no actual existence. A person cannot be affected by a crime wave, but only by an actual crime taking place. So there is the crime wave, which is like the light wave or the wave of the electrons. But the only thing that is when you actually feel a crime, it's like there is a specific electron in a specific location. Thus, the electron wave only becomes a solid real electron when it is measured and found to be in a particular location. Before the measurement takes place, the electron does not exist except as a probability. The act of observation makes the wave function collapse into a solid object that has extension in space. Well, it doesn't actually, again, making the point here, electrons are point particles, but they are little tiny bits of matter. In this case, an electron. It is important that this concept is understood. Before an observer detects the quantum particle, it does not exist. The consciousness brings the object into reality. Without conscious observation, no reality. We create our own universe. But what constitutes an observer? And more importantly, what about a physical system consisting of electrons and atoms and illuminated by photons where there is no observer? So now you will, I hope, understand the significance of Knox's poem. So who is the observer that maintains the solidity and indeed existence of the universe? Cheating the ferryman. In 1999, I wrote my first book. Initially, this was simply an attempt to understand what is taking place when somebody experiences a déjà vu. This is the overwhelming sensation that you're reliving something that you had already experienced or have experienced in an undefined time in your past. This is an extremely common sensation, and researchers suggested that at least 70% of human beings will experience this at least once in their lives. For me, it's been a frequent experience, and it usually manifests as part of my classic migraine aura. This is a curious set of visual and oral hallucinations that are perceived just before a migraine headache begins. I therefore had personal reasons for understanding more about this peculiar sensation. In my research, I discovered a paper by Dr. Arthur Funkhauser, an American physicist based in Switzerland. In this paper, he argues that a déjà vu is actually the memory of the circumstances experienced in a recent but forgotten dream that is subsequently perceived in real life. Funkhauser argues that this is why What is taking place feels familiar, but without any recognition regarding where the familiarity is sourced. I contacted Dr. Funkhauser and discussed with him how his dream theory of deja vu, as it's become known, was intriguing, but it was its central premise, a dream which subsequently comes true, has no basis in science. He agreed, but argued he had experienced a number of precognitive dreams, as had many of his clients. He actually now works as a Jungian analyst. This intrigued me and led me to the writings of an Anglo-Irish aeronautical engineer called John William Dunn. In 1902, while working in South Africa, Dunn had a series of powerful precognitive dreams which inspired him to keep a dream diary by his bedside. Over a number of years, Dunn discovered that many of his dreams were precognitive. In 1927, he published a book entitled An Experiment with Time, which presented irrefutable evidence as far as he was concerned that the future can be perceived in dreams. This book proved immensely popular, and thousands of people across the world started their own dream diaries. Dunn argued in later books that when we dream, we share our consciousness with another element of ourselves. He called this Observer 2, the dreamer themselves being Observer 1. Observer 2 exists in a different type of time, which, not surprisingly, he called Time 2. This form of time involves a perception of the contents of Observer 1's immediate future, awareness of which is available to Observer 2. In the dream state, the knowledge of Observer 2 is available to Observer 1, but is not recalled in waking life. Dunn suggests a wonderful analogy. He asked us to visualize Observer 1 sitting on a train carriage looking straight out of the carriage window at the station platform. As the train draws out of the station, the platform moves from the observer's present set of perceptions into the past, and the present is then filled with the views of the townscape surrounding the station. Observer 2, meanwhile, is sitting on the roof of the carriage and can see forward to take in the railway lines running off into the distance in either direction, including the station that has now disappeared from the worldview of Observer 1, but as far as Observer 2 is concerned, can still be seen and perceived, as can where the train is about to go. In effect, continuing the time analogy, he can see the contents of the future that Observer 1 from the confines of inside the carriage cannot see. Here was an analogy of how Funkhauser's dream theory may work, but it totally failed to explain the mechanism by which another part of ourselves can know the future. According to modern science, the future has yet to happen and therefore does not exist. So how can Observer 2 perceive it? I needed a more scientific explanation, and the one that was logical and rational. And it is then that I began researching near-death experiences, NDEs. Through a chance encounter with a business associate who had recently been diagnosed with a neurological illness called temporal lobe epilepsy, TLE, I discovered that there was a direct neurochemical link between TLE and the NDE. Earlier, I mentioned my own migraine-related aura states. Individuals who experience TLE have similar pre-seizure auras, but theirs are much more powerful. They involve time dilation, a sensation of leaving the body, elaborate hallucinations, a sensation of somebody sharing their consciousness, and, most importantly for me, profound deja vu perceptions. These perceptions, as was the case with my friend, involve precognitive deja vus, in which the contents of that person's immediate future is perceived, before it actually happens in reality. I have subsequently witnessed a TLE announcing a future event while in an aura state, an event that came to pass exactly as she described a few seconds later. On researching this further, I discovered that neurologists have noted many neurochemical similarities between NDEs and TLEs. Indeed, in recent years, it has also been discovered that a number of psychedelic substances, such as ketamine and dimethyltryptamine and psilocybin, can also create NDE-like experiences. I decided that it was the NDE that needed to be the central theme of my research. A near-death experience is exactly what the words describe. Many individuals over the centuries have reported during close encounters with death that a series of related perceptions are encountered. For a full review of the NDE, check out my latest book, The Near-Death Experience, The Science, Psychology and Anthropology Behind the Phenomenon. I discovered that a number of traits had been reported in most near-death experiences, and these included out-of-body experiences, travelling towards a light, a tunnel, encounters with an entity known as the being of light, time dilation, and, of most significance for me, a panoramic life review, in which the person's whole life, or snapshots of that life, are experienced. Indeed, there were 3 traits I found of possible significance in my attempt to explain déjà vu. They were the panoramic life review, the being of light, and time dilation. By analysing these in detail, I was able to create a hypothetical scenario of possible immortality that did not conflict with known or theoretical science, and in effect explain how precognitive déjà vu experiences can be explained. I call this concept cheating the ferryman, and 7 years later, in 2006, my first book explaining this concept was published. I differentiate between the classic near-death experience and what I term a real death experience, and argue that those who survive a close encounter with death perceive a number of the traits in a reduced way than that experienced in a real death experience. This involves a dilation of subjective time perception to such an extent that a century of objective time can be experienced in a fraction of a second. In effect, the dying person's consciousness falls into what Dunn called time 2. And stretching the link with Dunn's model, Dunn's observer 2 also becomes manifest within the consciousness of observer 1. Using my own terminology, time 2 I call the Bohmian IMAX, and observer 1 and 2 are the eidolon and daemon respectively. But most importantly, it is how the PLR, or panoramic life review, is perceived in a real death experience. In a near-death experience, the dying person experiences their life flashing by in a series of snapshots, or as if their whole life had been recorded and is perceived as a fast-forwarded video recording. But in a real death experience, the whole life is experienced second by second. In effect, their life is totally relived. But let me explain my terminology here, as it is very important. In his 1992 book, Consciousness Explained, famous philosopher Daniel Dennett was to sarcastically dismiss the long-held belief that the universe comprises of 2 quite distinct types of stuff, matter and spirit. That is, material things that have extension in space and non-physical things that do not. The body is matter, whereas the mind is not. This is known technically as substance dualism. This idea was discussed extensively by French philosopher René Descartes, and so is also referred to as Cartesian dualism. Descartes presented his ideas in his 1641 book, Meditations on First Philosophy. For eliminative materialists such as Daniel Dennett, this idea is ludicrous. They argue that if mind is not matter, but some kind of ghost in the machine, a term coined by another eliminative materialist philosopher, Gilbert Ryle, in 1949, how can it physically affect matter in any way? In mechanics, every action is brought about by a force, but spirit, as it is defined, cannot create any force. So how does it influence nerves to bring about muscular contractions? Indeed, Dennett takes this further by suggesting that the idea of a ghost in the machine brings about an infinite regress. For example, when I perceive the outside world, I imagine a miniature version of myself sitting in a small room inside my head. It has a pair of speakers on either side broadcasting the sound signals from my ears and a stereo TV screen in front of me showing me what my eyes are seeing. I sit in a chair that reproduces the nerve sensations from my skin. In this way, all my sensations are presented to me. All these are the contents of my consciousness, and I am the audience who experiences them. But there's a problem. If I imagine this little homunculus in my head, then he, in turn, must have a little person in his head, sitting in his own little room, and so on and so on. This quickly becomes an infinite regress of ever smaller homunculi. This makes no sense. This inner auditorium is what Dennett calls the Cartesian theatre. This is the place in the brain where consciousness resides and observes the sights and sounds processed by the senses. But for Dennett, to believe this is to fall into another version of Cartesian dualism. My concept of the Bohmian IMAX, or Bimax, is a counterpoint to Dennett's Cartesian theatre. I argue that mind generates reality, and that reality is richer in detail and clarity as an IMAX cinema in relation to a stage theatre. The word Bohmian is in recognition of the work of Anglo-American physicist David Bohm. Bohm believed that holograms could be used to explain his belief that our perceptions of separate things is an illusion, and that there exists an underlying order of wholeness. He likened this to a flowing stream. He asked us to visualize the surface of this stream. We see an ever-changing pattern of vortices, ripples, waves, and splashes. These seem real, but in actual fact they have no independence from their underlying cause, the continual flowing of the water. They have no autonomy of their own. They cannot exist without this underlying motion. And so, he argued, it is with what we believe to be perceived reality, including human consciousness itself. From this, Bohm suggested a model whereby the whole universe can be thought of as a kind of giant flowing hologram, or as he termed it, hollow movement, in which a total order is contained in some implicit sense in each region of space and time. He called this higher level of reality the implicate order. From this, our perceptual universe, the explicate order is projected. The apparent stability and solidity of the objects and entities within the explicate order are generated and sustained by an ongoing process of enfoldment and unfoldment. We shall return to this later. Now we turn our attention to the daemon and the eidolon. These are terms taken from the ancient Greek pre-Socratics, which then became central to the Eleusinian mystery cults. It was believed that we all have two components to our personalities, an eidolon, which is the everyday person that exists in the world and has limited knowledge of that world presented through its five senses. The eidolon is mortal, and after one life dies. The daemon, on the other hand, is immortal and lives multiple lives. The daemon acts as the protector and spirit guide of the eidolon. Of great significance is that this belief was to become a central part of many esoteric belief systems and occult practices. So, to recap, in Cheating the Ferryman, I argue that at the point of death, human consciousness, which up to that point has been singular, splits into two. In effect, the daemon manifests and becomes self-aware. The daemon becomes aware of itself and its role in facilitating the next stage of consciousness, whereas the dying eidolon, which can only live one life, is about to cease to exist. The newly self-aware daemon has certain processes it needs to activate, including the starting of the panoramic life review. However, in a near-death experience, one that the eidolon survives, the newly self-aware daemon realizes that death is not about to take place, and realizes that literal minute-by-minute life review is not needed, and, to use an analogy from modern video technology, metaphorically presses the fast forward on the life review. This is perceived by the eidolon, as is regularly reported by near-death experience survivors. "I saw my life flash before my eyes," is the common description. But if the near-death experience is actually a real death experience, then death is the only outcome for that specific eidolon, and the daemon continues with the panoramic life review, which starts in real-time duration. The previous eidolonic consciousness is snuffed out to be replaced by a new eidolon, which has no memories of its previous life. That eidolon then goes through a birth process within the panoramic life review and begins a new life experience within the Bimax, or the Bohmian IMAX. To recap, this is a minute-by-minute recreation of the previous life. Well, it is initially anyway. Cheating the Ferryman suggests that your consciousness enters a timeless location at the point of death, and you are reborn in a new version of your previous life. You are reborn as you, not as somebody else. You are born of the same parents, or possibly any scenario whereby your exact DNA profile is reproduced. Of course, your birth location and scenario will depend upon a myriad of life decisions made by your parents. your grandparents, and indeed all your ancestors. Each outcome of every decision is made by a consciousness that can collapse a wave function, and therefore creates a reality out of the information field that exists within that macroverse. Your rebirth will involve you downloading an initial information field based very closely on your previous life. This allows for logical and sequential progression, whereby the last life's issues can be resolved on or unfulfilled scenarios followed through. These alternative realities are created from information, not physical objects, although their amalgamations are perceived as being physical objects. This is like loading a third-person role-playing computer game. The game scenario is rendered from digital information that appears as a location and landscape on your PC screen. More accurately, a virtual reality world as rendered by an Oculus Rift or similar device. Once you start this new life, all outcomes of all your decisions can be collapsed. But once collapsed, the scenario becomes physical and cannot be changed. Decision by decision, your new life unfolds, or to use David Bohm's reference, out of the implicate order and into the explicate order. But the daemon can guide you only as long as it has experienced the decision outcomes taken in your previous lives. When a completely new scenario is encountered, its only advice can be general, because it, like the Eidolon, is encountering this set of circumstances for the first time. And here is the big difference between Itlad and reincarnation. Here there is development, or cheating the ferryman and reincarnation. Here there is development. Here there is a carry-through of life experiences. Here is the opportunity to learn from one's mistakes. Indeed, here is a scenario to right the wrongs and explore other avenues not taken. Over many lives, because at the end of each one a new one is encountered, all roads can be taken, especially with an effective and engaged daemon. But what about the other consciousnesses we interact with within the Bimax, or the Bohmian IMAX? Are they real or simply zombies? Or just like the non-sentient sprites we encounter in computer games? Well, this is where Pandeism comes into the equation, and where I attempt to answer the question first posited at the start of the chapter. Who is the observer that collapses the wave function of seemingly unobserved realities? Let's return to the central concept of cheating the ferryman. In this, each consciousness at the point of death goes back and relives its life. This life is in the same time and culture as the previous life. But this time, the daemon guides the Eidolon using knowledge gained from the previous life, or lives, as multiple lives are experienced, and with each life more knowledge is achieved and an individuated evolution takes place. But, and this is a crucial point, this is happening to every other sentient intelligence that the original Eidolon interfaces within each life iteration. Millions of daemon-guided singular consciousnesses embodied as Eidolons are collectively evolving as an UberDaemon, Uber-Eidolon, which is the collective known as society. As this society evolves, it will develop new technologies and medical advances within its own historical time period. This again is important. Each society will, over multiple runs through its collective Bohmian IMAXs, evolve scientifically and culturally, and each individual Eidolonic consciousness within that Bimax will be reborn into progressively more sophisticated cultural environments. Scientific and medical advances will be made by those who learn from their multiple lives and iteratively apply this knowledge. Each individual contributes to a collective change. And Bohmian IMAX after Bohmian IMAX, this will evolve a technological civilization similar and in some cases identical to our own 21st century world. This means that discoveries will be made which will eradicate diseases and illnesses. People will survive accidents that in earlier Bimaxes would have killed them. This in turn will allow these Eidolons to live a full life, and in turn for them to contribute to society as a whole. And indeed, as an aside, this is the issue that gets round the question that I'm asked an awful lot. What happens to people who are crippled, children who die very young, these kind of things? This explains what happens to them. They die in your world, but they will be reborn into a Bimax which ultimately will have the technology to cure whatever illness they had. Bear that in mind. So going back, But if time is orthogonal and not linear, by orthogonal I mean it runs at a right angle to the normal flow of time, these earlier societies exist concurrent to our own. Indeed, how would we know if our society is not one of these earlier ones? Or more interestingly, that there has only ever been actually one society and we are in it. After all, if time is subjective, then why should this not be the case? So all human beings, since time immemorial, may be actually still alive and experiencing life now. We are all evolving together. In effect, this is a variation on Pandeism, in which we are all really one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. Cheating the Ferryman proposes a model of human immortality that makes logical sense. It gives consciousness a reason for being rather than simply a pointless exercise in a nihilism that achieves nothing. We are here to learn and grow towards perfection. But most importantly, Cheating the Ferryman is supported by the science, which other alternative models of survival after death are not. But what exactly is consciousness? Philosopher David Chalmers has argued that how the brain creates referential self-awareness is the greatest problem for modern science, a mystery that we are no nearer solving now than we were 100 years ago. I would like to suggest that consciousness is the medium whereby information becomes physical, in the sense that it becomes sensual. Indeed, could it be that consciousness and the universe are simply manifestations of a deeper reality, a reality that is actually unitary in nature? Are we all a singular consciousness experiencing itself subjectively? If we are, then what is the nature of that consciousness? Is this just another variation on Brahman, the concept that you have in Vedanta? Or is it more? I suspect that we all have levels of awareness. This starts with the Eidolon, the consciousness that exists within the simulation and experiences just one life. It is the equivalent of any in-game avatar generated for a single gameplay session within a video game. It exists for one game which ends at its death within the gameplay. This is a single life. As we have already discussed, the Eidolon is born, experiences a life and then ceases to exist. When a new game is started, a new Eidolon is created with no memories of the past life or game. But experiencing every gameplay is the game player who exists outside of the game. This is the daemon. It remembers all previous games' lives and uses this knowledge to assist each new Eidolon to advance successfully through the game. How effective it will be in doing this will depend upon various factors. For a full discussion on how this may work, check out my books The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, 2008, and Opening the Doors of Perception, The Keys to Cosmic Awareness, 2016. And the book that this section is adapted from, Cheating the Ferryman, The Revolutionary Science of Life After Death, 2022. We therefore have two forms of memory. Eidolonic memory, EM, which is the recollections of experiences encountered within one run of the game, while demonic memory, DM, on the other hand, is the memories of all the previous games experienced by the daemon. Eidolonic memory is precisely what the famous Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung called the personal unconscious. Demonic memory has an awareness of the events which each individual EM is cognizant. What is of great importance here is to realise that there will be a point in the game where demonic consciousness will have no prior knowledge. Although it can guide the Eidolon using its previous experiences, its precognitive abilities will have ceased. I have argued this in the past, and this is what Deja vu experiences are perceived. I have argued this in the past, and this is why Deja vu experiences are perceived less and less as we age, as argued by Adachi et al. In 2003. But I now believe that there may be another two levels above this daemon-Eidolon dyad. These I call the UberDaemon and the GoDaemon. The UberDaemon is in effect the consciousness that created the game itself. It has full access to all the information contained within David Bohm's implicate order that involves humanity. This is identical to Jung's second level of awareness, the collective unconscious. Jung defined this as the collective unconscious as the ancestral heritage of possibilities of representation is not individual but common to all men, and perhaps even to all animals, and is the true basis of the individual psyche. I would like to argue that the Jungian collective unconscious is the source of two of the experiences that are regularly cited as evidence for survival after death, and are seemingly contradictory to my cheating the ferryman hypothesis. The first is past life memories that are either spontaneously recalled or evoked through hypnotic regression. In these, individuals describe in detail elements of another life experienced in the past. These facts are subsequently checked and found to be true. I would like to suggest that what is really taking place here is the person is tapping into the collective unconscious of the human species and has randomly attuned to a specific lifetime. This is a memory of a past life, but not their life. This information may be carried through in our DNA or simply facilitated by attuning into a broader area of Bohm's implicate order. The second area that the collective unconscious could explain is clairvoyance and psychic mediums. These individuals attune into the collective unconscious and pick up information created by the expectations of their clients. Furthermore, one could add as an additional explanation that such experiences could be related directly to my developing egregore model, which I've discussed in a number of my books. And now we turn to the GoDaemon. By this I mean the collective consciousness of everything in the multiverse. This is what the Hindus mean when they discuss Brahman, Kabbalists when they describe the Ein Sof, and the Kashmiri Shaivites' concept of Chitti. In effect, this is pure Advaita, non-dualism, a model of understanding whereby everything is created out of pure consciousness that is information. And it is this greater version of ourselves, the God within, that we are advised to search for, that manifests the tree in the quad. And what is the technical term for this idea that God has a form of pure consciousness? I'll read that again. And what is the technical term for the idea that God has as a form of pure consciousness manifesting as everything that exists? Yeah. It's called Pandeism.